Some scenes in this program have been reenacted, including the depiction of certain crime scene investigations. A scientist tries to establish when a murder occurred. His only clues are insects collected from the body. Forensic investigators puzzle over a partial skeleton found in a forest. They have two pieces of evidence to work with, a skull and a wasp's nest. In a trash-filled house, detectives find 3 people dead. 2 of the victims are mummified. To solve the bizarre case, investigators rely on dead beetles. Insects may be the only witnesses to a crime, but bugs tell no tales. Or do they? To solve a murder, investigators often must unravel a tangled web of clues. Sun-kissed Hawaii is a vacationer's dream. Sand, surf, and balmy temperatures lure tourists by the thousands. But life in paradise can have a seamier side. In late December 1989, a search team scoured the forest near a small town on the island of Oahu. They were looking for clues in the disappearance of 32-year-old Roxanne Tandal. Family members were concerned because Roxanne hadn't shown up for work and no one had heard from her in days. Detectives Andrew Glushenko, Joe Self, and Rufus Kaukani received the call that she was missing. Relatives told police this wasn't Roxanne's normal behavior. If she was safe, she would have come home or called. They feared something terrible had happened. They were afraid Roxanne may have been killed. Neighbors believed that she had a violent quarrel with estranged husband Benjamin shortly before she disappeared. The couple were about to be divorced, with Roxanne gaining custody of their 2 sons. Neighbors heard loud noises and several thumps coming from Tandal's house. Suspicion quickly fell on Benjamin Tandal. Although Benjamin had appeared in person to report Roxanne's disappearance, Detective Kaukani thought Tandal's subsequent behavior was odd.
What was kind of suspicious about the report that was made by the husband at the Kahuku police station is that the officer asked for an identification, a photograph of her, so they could, pass it around. Instead of taking a photograph and taking it back to the station, he picked up clothes and he went to Wailua, which is probably another 20 miles, 15 miles away, to wash clothes. And that's kind of not indicative of somebody who's caring and concerned about a missing person.
All right, Dave.
Suspicious that foul play might be involved, police obtained a warrant and searched Roxanne's home. If Roxanne was alive, perhaps they could find some clues to help locate her. If Benjamin had kidnapped or killed her, they needed evidence to prove it. Investigators brought with them a Luma light, a device that makes blood and fingerprints visible. The operator's goggles cut through the glare of the bright blue light so he can pick out clues that would otherwise go unnoticed. The light revealed a fine mist of blood droplets on Roxanne's ironing board and in her bedroom.
See? Those smears? Yeah. Just like we thought.
The search for a missing person suddenly became a murder investigation.
Anytime you have a surface with some blood on it and you hit it with a heavy force, it's going to fly out and spatter. And the harder that you hit it, the more force that you use, the finer that the spatter will be.
Where was Roxanne Tandal's body? Prosecutors needed it to build a strong case. Without it, her killer would likely go free. Detectives raced against time. In Hawaii's tropical heat and humidity, corpses decay rapidly. Telltale clues can be lost. Evidence tying Roxanne's death to her killer could disappear entirely. A major break in the case came on New Year's Eve, 1989, 2 weeks after Roxanne's disappearance.
Hey guys, I think I found something over here.
Searchers found the body of a human female. She had been wrapped in 2 blankets, both tied securely by fabric strips. Marks on the body suggested she was strangled and hit forcefully on the head.
We found our victim. She's about a quarter of a mile south.
Although her face was blackened and her body swollen, family members recognized the remains as Roxanne's.
It's going to be about 5:30.
When investigators opened the blankets, flies emerged.
Examiner and our forensics team to our location. All right, guys.
The next morning, detectives called University of Hawaii entomologist Lee Goff, one of the most respected insect scientists in the United States.
How are you, Dr. Goff? Detective Glushenko. This is Detective Rufus Kalkani. He's the
Hi,
lead
Doc.
investigator.
Like it or not, insects are mankind's constant companions, thriving alongside us throughout our lives and well afterward.
Open the blanket a little bit just to get a visual.
As a forensic consultant, Goff turns the abundance of insects to his advantage. His specialty is using bugs as a kind of biological stopwatch. If detectives hoped to tie this murder to Benjamin Tandal or to anyone else, they needed to get some answers from the bugs.
Give them a chance to come back in and start feeling comfortable. Okay.
Goff would act as their interpreter.
Really, when you're dealing with insects, you're looking at the largest group of animals that are on the face of the earth, the largest single group. A conservative estimate, very conservative, would give you 750,000 described species, and in reality, I think it's probably much closer to 1 million.
Insects compete with us for food and shelter. At death, we may actually become their food and shelter. That's what Goff counts on. When he arrived at the crime scene, Goff was careful to collect all the insects he could. He snared flying bugs in a net. Others he picked off the body with tweezers. Goff would use the flies to pinpoint when the victim was killed. Because insects live, grow, and die in predictable intervals, their life cycles can be precisely timed out, sometimes down to the hour.
And in order to figure out the actual time of death, you have to have as complete a collection as possible of all of the insects that you find on the body. And for each of those insects, then you have to know when they occur on the body and what the duration of their life cycle is. If you're working in the early stages of decomposition, say within the first 2 weeks, what you're really interested in are individual species of flies.
In Hawaii's sultry climate, insects thrived on the victim's remains, providing Goff with ample specimens to work with.
You look for the most mature specimens that are there, but you try and get a general sampling of everything that's on the body, either on wrappings, clothing, or actually on the surface. Then, as the body is removed, you want to look at what's crawling around on the soil underneath the body, because very frequently, especially as decomposition progresses, you find that the center of arthropod activity shifts from the body itself to the kind of interface between the body and the soil. So you'll have a lot of things present there that are very significant in your estimation that aren't going to actually be on the body.
Goff studied the samples at his lab at the University of Hawaii. After the female fly lays her eggs on a dead body, larvae soon develop. They're commonly called maggots. They secrete enzymes and spread bacteria, which enable them to consume human tissue. Goff believed that the maggots would tell the tale of the Tandal murder. But would they speak clearly enough to bring a murderer to justice? The life cycle of a fly is closely tied to our own. When a life ends, it's the beginning of a new generation of flies. A dead body is an invaluable source of food for hungry maggots. Flies begin to arrive moments after the host's death. Some unknown chemical from human remains attracts them from up to 2 miles away. As soon as they arrive, the females lay their eggs in protected areas, natural body openings, wounds, and folds of skin.
Generally here in Hawaii, the species we deal with, you're looking about 12 to 18 hours between the time the egg is laid and the egg hatches. Then you have your maggot. The maggots then congregate, and they feed together, they form this mass, and they're going to move through the body together. So in any given mass, because not everybody lays their eggs at the same time, you may have maggots of several different species and quite frequently different age classes.
As they mature, maggots pass through 5 stages that entomologists call instars. From infant to adult takes several days to several weeks, depending on species and environmental conditions. Figure out what species is invading a body at a crime scene, observe the particular stage of its development, and you can trace an insect's short life back to the time of death of its human host. Lee Goff did just that to determine precisely when the victim was murdered. Armed with that information, police could check the alibis of any suspects.
The initial analysis showed about 10.5 days of insect activity. I knew it was longer than that. I knew there was a fair amount of literature that would back that up.
Goff suspected the tightly wrapped blankets may have delayed the fly's arrival by several days. He realized he would have to fashion an experiment to simulate the same conditions under which the victim's body was discovered. To determine when the victim was killed, Goff relied on a staple of biological research, a dead pig.
But to try and pin it down, what I actually did was get a 50-pound pig and duplicate the wrappings and place the animal out in a somewhat similar situation, and then determine how long it took for the insects to actually go down and get to the point where they could oviposit on the pig.
Goff unwrapped the pig periodically to check for signs of fly eggs. Nearly all of the insects collected from the victim's body were either maggots, adolescent or adult flies. Although decomposed, it wasn't out long enough to attract many other insect species.
After the first couple of weeks, you start running out of flies. And then we have to go into what we call succession. And this works the idea that any insect that feeds on the body is going to change it. And by changing the body, then it makes it attractive to another group of insects. And their feeding makes it attractive to yet another group, and so on down the line.
During succession, entomologists expect to see a more or less orderly transition from one insect species to another as the bugs arrive at a corpse and begin feeding. Depending on the weather, the numbers and types of insects vary. Goff altered the amount of sun, shade, and water on the pig to mimic what may have happened to the victim's corpse. But how long did it take for the first egg-laying flies to arrive? Goff didn't need to wait long for an answer. He observed the first flies on the pig carcass 2.5 days after it was left in the open, wrapped and bound. Goff added the time observed during the pig experiment to his initial time of death estimate of 10.5 days. He was convinced the victim was murdered no fewer than 13 days before her body was discovered on December 31st. Those extra 2.5 days made all the difference. Goff's estimate dovetailed almost exactly with the date of the victim's disappearance and the discovery of her body 2 weeks later on New Year's Eve. Neighbors told investigators they last saw her in the late afternoon of December 17th. She was sitting stiffly in the passenger seat of Benjamin Tandal's pickup truck. Brought in by police for questioning, Benjamin agreed to take a lie detector test. He failed. Then he asked for an attorney. Officers charged Benjamin Tandal with the murder of his wife. As they prepared for trial, the prosecution's case was bolstered by additional evidence. Detectives discovered that one of the blankets used to wrap the victim's body matched a photo of a blanket on a sofa in her home. And the bloodstains found in her house during the police search matched her blood type. Benjamin Tandal was tried and convicted for the murder of Roxanne Tandal. On November 24, 1989, he was sentenced to life in prison. By establishing the timetable for the murder, Goff turned scattered clues into hard evidence.
Whatever Dr. Goff did helped the case a lot, especially during trial. You have a victim, a female victim who's missing for 2 weeks. Her husband is giving a story that she had left to go out to a party, to work, and then afterwards she might have gone out with some friends. You run into the possibility that maybe she was killed a week before the body was found as opposed to 2 weeks. So I think during the trial, Dr. Goff's testimony supported a lot of the circumstantial evidence that we had against the defendant as far as when she was killed.
The bugs had spoken, and their wordless testimony allowed a committed team of investigators to bring a killer to justice. Elsewhere, thousands of miles away in the Tennessee mountains, insects helped identify a missing person. A young man on a walk stumbles upon bones that were picked clean. Nearby, a weathered skull held the clue that would help investigators make sense of the jumbled remains. Eastern Tennessee, nestled in the foothills of the Cumberland Mountains, is famous for its fresh air and small-town charm. But the rural location also makes it an ideal place to dispose of murder victims. In January 1989, police received a call that a man had discovered a leaf-covered human skeleton. Aside from some bits of tattered cloth and pieces of jewelry, little was left to indicate that this was once a living, breathing person. Police found no identification of any kind, no hints of who the victim might have been. They found no evidence of trauma, yet they suspected foul play. How else would the bones have gotten there? Detectives found little to tell them what happened, except for a dried-out wasp's nest, long abandoned by its maker. Would it be enough of a clue? For help with the case, officers of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation contacted forensic anthropologist William Bass. Bass is an expert at reading human remains. He first established the age and sex of the victim. From the shape and size of the bones, he concluded that the skeleton belonged to a female who was not yet 18 when she died. But the cause of her death remained a mystery.
There were no gunshots in the skull. There were no damage to any of the long bones or the bones of the body. We did not recover the hyoid bone, which is a bone in the neck, and which is one that you get when you usually break if you strangle somebody.
Although investigators were eager to find out how the girl died, they first tried to determine when she died, in the hopes that it might lead to her identity.
Boy lives right over here in this house. Where is he now? He went on home.
In the summer, the soft tissue on the body in Tennessee will disappear very rapidly. You can go from what you and I are now to a complete skeleton in only about 2 weeks in July and August in Tennessee. If you die in the winter, it takes longer. But if you die in the winter, by the following spring or summer, the brain would have decayed and the cranial vault, which is the inside of the skull, cranial vault would be dry by that time.
At the crime scene, Bass looked at the wasp's nest. Knowing when it was made would help them pinpoint the victim's time of death. Wasps need a dry place to build their nests. Bass surmised the skull must have been on the ground for several months before it dried enough to become a suitable home for the insects.
So what this tells me is, in January, when this skull was found, with a wasp nest in it, that individual had been dead and the skull dried the previous summer, because this is when this wasp nest at least was built.
To confirm his findings, Bass contacted forensic entomologist Neil Haskell to help him identify the victim. Haskell consults in criminal investigations all over the U.S. Like all insects, wasps live, breed, and die in predictable patterns. In Tennessee, they begin nest building in late April or May. By summer, the nest bustles with activity. Then, when the colder weather comes, the wasps die back. The cycle starts over again the following spring.
Knowing this life cycle of this particular group of wasps enabled us to come up with a minimum time of the year that it took the wasps to build, plus another 6 to 8 months for the skull to become cleaned and dry.
In order for the queen wasp to have made her home there, the skull must have been completely dried out by spring 1988. Prior to the wasp's arrival, a brigade of egg-laying flies and carrion beetles must have foraged on the body and cleaned the skull late in the summer of 1987. Both Bass and Haskell concluded that the young girl died no later than midsummer 1987.
We coupled the developmental time of the wasp plus the normal insects that eat the carrion and came up with an estimate of at least a year and a half prior to finding this the skeletal remains that the person probably died. Now that was a minimum time. It could have been a little longer. In reality, it turned out that the body had actually been out there since February of 2 years prior to the time we found the remains.
The wasp nest had given investigators the information they desperately sought. Once they knew how long the girl had been dead, they began their hunt for her identity. They narrowed their search to teenage girls reported missing in 1987. They also took note of the jewelry found near the body. Investigators pulled a report detailing the disappearance of a young girl. In a photograph attached to the report, she wore some of the same jewelry found at the crime scene. The girl's name was Michelle Denise Anderson. She was 15 years old when she disappeared. Denise was last seen at a party on January 9th, 1987. When she didn't come home the next day, her mother reported her missing. Until police knew more about her disappearance, they considered Denise a runaway. Investigators had solved only part of the mystery. They knew Denise's name, and because of her age and the condition of the bones, that she was healthy when she died. They are convinced Denise was murdered, but they still don't know how. And no one has ever been charged with her murder. The case remains open. The investigation continues. The stories that bugs tell can fill in the missing pieces of a death investigation. For detectives in an Indianapolis suburb, insects would provide the only leads to 3 bizarre and puzzling deaths. Counted in the trillions, insects vastly outnumber any other creatures on Earth. Florida tropical biologist James Kastner has been studying bugs for 25 years, and the field is definitely growing.
Well, approximately 10 years ago, the estimate of total insect species in the world was maybe 2 to 3 million. More recently, there's been work done in the rainforest with fogging the treetops in a canopy, and this has now raised the estimate of total world insect species to 30 to 40 million.
Insects usually go unnoticed or are shunned altogether. They're maligned for spreading infection, destroying crops, and otherwise making life miserable. But without carnivorous insects and their appetites, the carcasses of dead animals would remain where they fell until bacteria consumed them. Not everyone finds bugs distasteful. Studying insects and other so-called lower life forms is nothing new. It's just becoming more widely practiced and providing better information. Forensic entomologist Jason Bird believes insects have a lot to teach us.
Forensic entomology has been around since 13th century China. It's been used extensively in Europe and Australia, and apparently it's pretty slow to catch on in the United States. It's really only had its current widespread use since the 1950s, and just within the past 10 years alone, it has enjoyed a resurgence of popularity.
Despite its obvious benefit to criminal investigation, forensic entomology is not a field of study sought out as enthusiastically as medicine or law. The ranks of forensic entomologists are slim. At most, a few dozen insect specialists in the United States regularly assist with murder cases. People see bugs not as partners, but as pests.
Unfortunately, most people treat insects as something creepy and something to recoil and be afraid from. And most of this is a cultural prejudice or just not understanding what insects are all about. I think anybody who takes the time to study insects and to learn how they live, learn the extremely interesting behaviors that they show, can't help but become interested in them, if not enamored with them.
The benefits can be many to those detectives willing to overcome their distaste for bugs. Insects can make or break an investigation. That's the message brought on this day by insect scientist Neil Haskell, who has come to Wilmington, North Carolina. His mission is simple: to introduce law enforcement to the exotic world of bugs and their ability to crack difficult cases.
The ultimate goal is to acquaint the law enforcement folks, the crime scene investigators and coroners, medical examiners with first of all, the importance of using entomological evidence in death investigations. Second of all, to train those investigators how to recognize and collect the proper specimens, and then how to preserve it and how to ship it and transfer it to a qualified forensic entomologist for evaluation and analysis.
Although insects can't communicate in a conventional sense, their behavior on a dead body can speak volumes to those who know how to listen. Haskell uses dead pigs as stand-ins for dead humans when teaching police officers and evidence technicians the finer points of forensic entomology. In his training sessions, Haskell tries to simulate the real world as best he can. He arranges the pigs as one might find a dead human, covered by brush, hidden out of sight.
These pigs have been put out to attract the carrion insects that are forever present in most of our environments. And it has been successful because we do know that under these carcasses we're going to be finding some fly larvae that have infested the carcasses. And this is what we would find on human remains that have been out for a period of time.
Haskell's class is no place for the squeamish, but the things his pupils see here are no worse than what they're likely to find in a real murder investigation. It's time for their next lesson: collecting maggots.
We're collecting some of the maggots as preserved specimens. We're also collecting some of the maggots as live specimens. We had the liver that we're going to be growing them on in what we call maggot motels. And today we're using liver, beef liver, and we put 15 or 20, 25 maggots in that, and then close it up, place it in this can or container, and then allow them to grow, monitor them daily or every 2 days to see how they're doing. And then, then we can, eventually they'll grow to adults, and then we can make positive identification of those specimens.
Female flies are the insect's first strike on a corpse. If something dies, they'll find it. When a female arrives on decomposing remains, she goes into an egg-laying frenzy.
The maggots are the result of the attraction of the chemical smells that are coming from the body that attract the adult flies in. Now the flies have developed and evolved over centuries to select out this specific, very specific kind of food, the rotting tissues of dead animals.
Yeah, we don't want to
motel ready too? Yeah.
Not all the fly offspring will survive, but the mother has given her ravenous young a fighting chance by choosing a ready source of sustenance.
Get it this way. We got to come around from the other side.
This female will deposit anywhere from 150 to maybe up to 400 eggs in a clutch, seeking out sites of protection such as the nose, nasal area, mouth, and eyes. Those eggs will then go through a period of time when they will eventually hatch, a few hours to a day or two depending on temperature.
The eggs will hatch into first-stage larvae, which will grow and develop for a few more hours and then shed their skin and go through several more changes. As maggots grow, so do their appetites. During their first 2 stages, they never stop eating. The individual maggots form a large mass that eats and moves as one.
And while they're in this maggot mass, configuration, temperatures within this mass will climb very, very high, 15, even up to 20 degrees centigrade above the normal outside air temperature or ambient temperature.
Back in the lab, Haskell examines the mass of maggots. The particular stage and rate of growth of the larvae will provide investigators with a good idea of how long a body has been left in the open. The maggots act as filters. They can be tested for chemicals and drugs they may have picked up from their host. For those of us who know how to listen, insects can be vocal witnesses to the circumstances of a person's death. In November 1987, residents of a middle-class Indianapolis suburb phoned police. They were worried that they hadn't seen their elderly male neighbor for a number of days. He lived there with his invalid sister and aunt. Police arrived at the house. When no one answered, they entered. The house was a complete mess. Investigators found refuse of all sorts in the kitchen: unwashed dishes, uneaten meals, discarded silverware, and empty packages. Bags of decaying food moldered in the garage. Then police found the homeowner, collapsed on the living room floor, apparently dead for some time. Not certain what they were facing, investigators called for backup. As more detectives arrived, neighbors began to congregate. Nearly every inch of the house was covered with trash. Police wondered what kind of person could live like this. The officers cautiously inspected every room. The search quickly took a bizarre twist.
What this? Gosh. Oh, yeah?
Investigators were shocked to find the mummified remains of two women in a pair of back bedrooms. Since the cause of death wasn't readily apparent, police assumed murder. Sergeant Reggie Roney recalls the grisly discovery.
We're treating this as a homicide scene because we don't know what has happened here. And my first view of the body is there's no body. All that's left is clothing, and it's kind of like a mummy laying there on the bed. And I look at it and I can see the little skull caps that the older women used to wear, and bed sheets, and I can tell all the bodily fluids have gone through the mattress, and it's just a skeletal type mummy.
The only evidence seemed to be an abundance of bugs, beetles mostly, found on the bodies of both women. Whatever happened here wasn't an ordinary death scene. It would take extraordinary means to sort it all out. Investigators on the scene of the triple deaths faced a double mystery. How did the victims die, and how long had they been dead? Autopsies would probably answer the first question, but the second one seemed unsolvable. At the crime scene, detectives meticulously cataloged each piece of evidence, including several dead flies and the dried husks shed by beetles, called cast skins. Each insect type was a valuable clue, but investigators weren't certain how to read the evidence. They also gathered samples of an unusual brown, stringy material found near both bodies. Baffled by what they found, they realized they needed the help of a forensic entomologist. They called on Neil Haskell. He met members of the Indiana University Medical Center Forensic Science team at the morgue for an autopsy.
Obviously, we had to determine how long these individuals had been there, because in the investigation it was important to pinpoint time of death. Obviously, who these individuals are, when they died, and possibly where they died and how they died. And so each one of the different forensic disciplines was providing pieces of that puzzle together.
Right there. Okay.
For Haskell, that meant identifying the particular insect species that colonized each of the women's remains.
Thank you. And for
Haskell noted a curious difference between the two female mummies. One's face contained most of the original flesh, while the second did not. From the second body, Haskell collected numerous empty puparia, or casings. These, he knew, were left behind by juvenile blowflies as they hatched into adulthood. But the first set of mummified remains was marked only by dead beetles. Why the difference? Haskell knew that decomposing remains almost immediately attract egg-laying female flies. Judging from the amount of flesh still on the body of one of the mummies, flies seem to have ignored it altogether. Insects are weather dependent. Their development is controlled by the seasons. Haskell suspected that weather had played a role. To gather more evidence, he visited the house where the bodies were discovered. In both bedrooms, he found beetle cast skins. But in one bedroom was an abundance of intact, dead beetles. In that room, he collected specimens of 3 different species.
The blinds had been pulled down. They were down, but behind those blinds, as I raised the blinds and searched the room, there were a couple hundred adult dried beetles that had come from the body and had tried to reach the out of doors and gone to the windows and could get no further. And so then they died on the windowsills.
Haskell was still puzzled by the pencil shaving-like substance found next to the dead beetles on the woman's body. At first, he theorized it was a kind of fungus. Then he remembered that a similar material had been found on a body in Copenhagen, Denmark in 1962. In his laboratory, Haskell put the substance under a microscope. As others had in the Copenhagen case, he identified the substance as beetle feces, excreted by the larvae. The feces is associated with remains that have been mummified for long periods. As detectives continued their search of the home, they found a diary written by the aunt. In her last entry, dated October 5, 1977, the aunt reported that her health was failing, and so was the health of her niece. Neither, the aunt wrote, had long to live. This information helped Haskell with his investigation. He theorized that the aunt, whose remains were more skeletonized than her niece's, must have died when the flies were still active. That would have been no later than autumn. The ant's body had less flesh because the flies arrived during warmer weather, laid their eggs, and their larvae had cleaned the skeleton. Haskell concluded that the ant, the older of the pair, died first in October 1977. The niece likely would have died in late December 1977, or perhaps early January 1978. The niece's body was better preserved because her death came in the coldest part of the year. There simply were no egg-laying flies around to be attracted to the chemical signals emanating from her remains.
They got up and moved in the middle of the night.
The mystery of when the women died was solved. Other questions persisted. Why were the women kept in the house for 10 years after they died? Police could only speculate on the details of their lives. The diary helped fill in some of the missing pieces. The aunt had fallen in the backyard and broken her hip. She could no longer get around. Soon after the aunt was injured, her niece also broke her hip. The man looked after both women around the clock as their health continued to fail. After his aunt died, the man decided to keep her in the house rather than alert anyone to her passing. Shortly after, his sister died. He decided to keep her death a secret as well. He managed to maintain the charade for 10 years. To avoid being discovered, he always ordered enough groceries for 3 people. He refused to allow the delivery person to bring them into the house for fear the smell would be noticed. He insisted that the bags be slipped under the garage door. That explained the sacks of uneaten food rotting in the garage. As the weather warmed, the odors from the bodies surely would have been difficult to live with. To the neighbors, the man was friendly enough, but he kept them at arm's length. When asked about the health of his aunt or sister, he'd be non-committal. Sometimes he'd complain that the women were keeping him up all night, or give details of their failing health. Remarkably, the neighbors kept their distance and never set foot in his home. As detectives investigated further, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. They discovered that the man received at least $140,000 in fraudulent Social Security checks after the women's deaths. But that may have only been part of the reason. Perhaps the decision to keep the bodies was motivated more by compassion than greed.
He had cared for them so long and looked after them 24 hours on a daily basis. I think that he just probably couldn't bring himself to give up his loved ones.
No charges were ever filed in the case of the Indianapolis mummies. The trio's deaths were officially recorded as due to natural causes. Before they died, they named their church as the beneficiary of the estate. The Social Security money owed to the government was partially paid back by the sale of the property. The bugs had helped detectives solve the curious case of the Indianapolis mummies. However unusual, it was one investigation among hundreds for insect specialists like Neil Haskell. Haskell says that bugs are becoming powerful allies in an age when sophisticated technology is figuring more and more into criminal cases. One example is the analysis of human DNA found in the blood that bugs take from human bodies.
The mosquito feed and it swells up. Its abdomen swells. That's a human blood meal in there. And you can analyze that blood meal for human DNA. And it works in mosquitoes, bed bugs, fleas, and lice now. Tremendous tool.
The study of insects is the study of the great tenacity and variety of life. Yet modern science has much to learn about insect life, especially as it applies to investigating death. According to entomologist Lee Goff, many details are still unknown.
We need to put forensic entomology on a firmer statistical basis. Right now, the statistical basis is just beginning to be developed, and we need to see more modeling in terms of what's going on with the corpses. So there's an awful lot of research. I think probably I've got more questions now than I had when I got into it 15 years ago.
Here we go.
As methods improve, as more scientists enter the field and learn more about insect behavior, the value of forensic entomology will grow.
Now, when we first started, actually, I'd go back to 15 years ago when I first became involved in forensic entomology. Law enforcement agencies thought we were a little bit nuts and really were a little skeptical that we'd be able to give them anything that would be of use. Over the past 15 years, by working very diligently with different agencies and different groups of people, we've been able to convince them that, in fact, it is a very powerful tool for use in their investigation. So I'd say now it's very widely accepted.
No matter how technical our world becomes, the simplest methods are sometimes the best. And sometimes the least likely sources are the most dependable. Slowly, homicide investigators are beginning to realize the invaluable contributions made by the smallest witnesses to murder. A mother's search for her daughter spans 2 decades. She no longer knows what her child looks like. Will digital technology help locate her? A man slays his family and vanishes without a trace for 18 years. Can the work of a sculptor flush him out of hiding? 2 hunters stumble across human remains. Can an artist put flesh on the bones and give the victim a name? Forensic artists combine science, intuition, and skill to build likenesses of the murdered and the missing. Their work can reunite families or help solve a murder, creating faces of hope and faces of tragedy. Under a gray Texas sky in the winter of 1994, 2 hunters trespassed on private land outside of Lubbock. But their offense would pale in comparison to what they'd discover that day in remote Yellow House Canyon. They stumbled onto the partial remains of a human skeleton and a white, high-heeled shoe lying nearby. Though alarmed by their discovery, they knew if they called the police, they'd be fined for poaching. The hunters decided to leave the bones for someone else to find. But when they told a friend what they'd seen, he called the sheriff. The hunters agreed to take Deputy Tom Watson of the Lubbock County Sheriff's Department to the site of their find. Watson immediately suspected the remains belonged to a murder victim, dumped in the canyon to conceal the crime. Only the skull and a few bones remained. Over time, animals must have dragged away parts of the body. Watson directed his deputies to tape off a wide area to be searched for more evidence. Once the crime scene had been documented on film, he called in the county pathologist to examine the bones. The pathologist collected the bones and took them back to his lab, where they could be examined for signs of trauma.
I don't believe we have any local people missing.
He confirmed Watson's suspicions. The victim was murdered. The upper part of the skeleton bore multiple stab marks, enough to kill a person several times over. The case was now officially a homicide. Watson returned to the canyon the next day to sweep for more evidence. To capture the killer, he first had to name the victim. But his search uncovered no form of identification. The only clothing was the one shoe. To identify his victim, he desperately needed more to go on.
The first thing we have to do is determine whether it's male, female, and approximate age. Check those statistics against any possible missing persons that we might have locally. If we don't find anything there, then we expand the search out statewide into New Mexico and Oklahoma. And then if we still haven't got her identified, then we go national with it.
The search team recovered more bones and, luckily, almost all of the victim's teeth, but nothing more. No personal effects that could clue them in to who the victim was or when the killing occurred. Watson turned the bones over to a forensic pathologist who was able to narrow down the possibilities. He concluded that the victim was a white female, 18 to 24 years old. The weathering on the bones suggested she'd been dead at least 2 years. Tooth fillings in the lower jaw and a crown in the upper jaw offered more identifying features. The teeth were x-rayed so they could be compared to dental charts of missing white females of the same age. Using the x-rays, Watson began a search to make a match. He chased dozens of leads, some from as far as New Jersey, but none matched the dental records of the woman found in Yellow House Canyon. His investigation was leading nowhere. Meanwhile, a killer remained free. Watson needed more than the victim's bones and teeth to identify her. He needed to give the woman a face. For that, he turned to one of America's leading experts on facial reconstruction. Karen Taylor has worked for the Texas Department of Public Safety in Austin for 16 years. As a forensic artist, she helps identify skeletons by recreating what the person looked like when alive. Her images are distributed by police and the media in the hopes that the remains will be identified. Using techniques she's developed over the years, Taylor has had remarkable success. She serves police jurisdictions throughout Texas and works on cases across the country. Her job keeps her extremely busy. The unidentified woman from Yellow House Canyon was one among many nameless persons awaiting a face.
Deputy Tom Watson from the Lubbock County Sheriff's Office brought me the skull of an unidentified white female found in that area, and he asked that I try to build a face on that skull to help him identify her. And the information was provided to me that had been developed by an anthropologist to examine the skeleton. And so I knew from Tom's reports that the person I was going to be drawing was a young white female. I unfortunately didn't have a lot of other information. There was no clothing, for instance. Clothing is a very good clue as to body weight for me from skeletal remains. There was also no hair, which provides a added complication, especially in a case of a female. So because there was so little to work with, the case was a little more difficult than some of them are.
Without the victim's clothing to use as a guideline, Taylor had to take her cues from the skull alone. When putting a face on a human skull, one of the most critical parts is determining how thick the flesh will be. Taylor relies on standard tables of measurements developed by forensic anthropologists and classified by sex and race. Based on these measurements, she cuts out rubber markers that match the average depth of the skin. She glues them onto the skull at 21 anthropological landmarks, like the cheeks and chin. When the markers are in place, photographs of the skull are taken. For Taylor to accurately draw the face, the photographs must be exactly life-size and not distorted at all. After placing transparent paper over the photograph, she uses the rubber markers as guides in drawing the facial contours. It's the first step in recreating the image that may lead to the identity of the victim. Taylor also relies on scientific formulas to draw in the eyes, nose, and other features. The average human eyeball is between 24 and 25 millimeters in diameter. Since this is also the size of a U.S. quarter, Taylor has a convenient tool for tracing in each eye.
I also know from reading some ophthalmology texts that the average person has an iris diameter, an iris width really, that is between 11 and 13 millimeters. And I have little red lines on this scale showing the average range. So, and I've checked it on a number of people, and it seems to hold true for most everyone. Most everyone's iris will fall right in that range.
Taylor relies on her knowledge of anatomy to draw in the eyelids. On many people, the orbit, or eye socket, has a raised piece of bone on its outer edge. The inner edge of the socket has another bony landmark. These are the points of attachment for the ligament that stretches across the eyeball and controls the movement of the eyelid.
Our upper lids are curved slightly more than the lower lids. They tend to drop slightly over the top of the iris when looking at a person in life.
Taylor next draws the victim's nose, relying on some rules of thumb and hints provided by the skull.
Surprisingly, we do have some pretty good information about noses to help predict the look of a nose in life based on the bony clues.
Because the victim was a white female, Taylor knows to add 5 millimeters to each side of the nasal opening. That represents the width of the nose. If the victim were African American, Taylor would add 8 millimeters to each side. A bony spine at the base suggests how far the nose projects.
Because that little bit of bone tells me whether to tip the nose down or to tip it up or whether it's rather level. And so I'm looking at the profile to determine that angulation of the nasal spine, and that gives me a hint. In this case, this is quite an upturned nasal spine, so I want a tip of a nose that's up. She's a young girl. She's got a youthful little nose. And the nasal spine tells me it's turned up at the tip.
When the mouth is relaxed, the lips tend to cover the 6 front teeth. When we smile, we flash as many as 10 teeth. Taylor draws the unidentified woman's mouth in a relaxed expression to give her a neutral appearance.
So if I make a mark at the outside of those canines, that should give me an approximation of the width of the mouth. If you can see the staining of the gum line at the edge of the enamel of the teeth, gives us a ballpark idea of the vertical dimension for the lips. And again, I know that she's young, I know that she's white, so I'm thinking young white female as I draw this little mouth.
From a faceless skull, Taylor will soon create the image of a woman. She hopes it will give a name to the victim and eventually name the killer. As Karen Taylor added the finishing touches to her portrait of the unidentified woman, the victim's face was reborn. The image was now ready for prime time. Taylor's drawing was shown on television and local newspapers, giving anyone who recognized the woman the opportunity to provide information about her. For Sheriff's Deputy Tom Watson, the broadcast was a defining moment in the case.
This particular case was very frustrating for the first 6 months because we were not able to identify her. We were about to the end of all of our options as far as getting her identified until we did have the forensic drawing made. And once we aired that on the media, within a week we had 2 callers gave us the name of the dead girl.
The callers identified Taylor's drawing as Belinda K. Tillery, who'd been missing for 2 years. One of the callers was Tillery's mother, who had lost touch with her daughter. The face on the screen delivered an eerie shock of recognition. Now, with a name to go with the face, Taylor obtained a copy of Belinda Tillery's driver's license photograph. She compared it to her drawing to study the similarities that led to Tillery's identification. The resemblance was undeniable.
She has narrow or rather close-set eyes, and yet very broad face, broad cheeks. And this small nose, and the width of the nose proportionately is very close here. The mouth size is almost exactly right, and the fact that there's a very wide chin favorably compares also.
For closer identification, Taylor superimposed the photograph of Belinda Tillery onto the victim's skull.
As I was able to get the facial image on top of the skull and start to compare it, I had a couple of difficulties by this method. One being that her face is slightly turned in her driver's license photo, therefore I can't quite get the nose position correctly. However, when I put the eyes pretty much centered in the orbits, I see that she does have the facial width that my drawing shows and that I could see in this skull. So I could see that it's a pretty favorable comparison, and we probably should go ahead with finding dental records on this person if possible to make a more positive comparison.
A positive identification couldn't be made until X-rays of the victim's teeth were compared with dental records of Belinda Tillery. Dr. David Duell, a forensic dentist with the Texas Department of Public Safety, made the comparison. He found the bone structure to be the same. Teeth with fillings matched. Both X-rays showed a root canal on the same tooth, and a temporary crown was identical on each film. Dr. Duell declared it a match. Taylor's work had identified the victim. It was now up to Deputy Watson to track down the killer. He started by interviewing Belinda Tillery's friends and neighbors. Watson learned that Tillery had had an abusive boyfriend named Troy Armstrong. It was rumored that he'd become angry when she told him she was pregnant with someone else's child. Watson obtained a photograph of Armstrong and went looking for him. He tracked him to Roswell, New Mexico. There, he searched the town. He questioned the locals, digging for any lead he could find. But Armstrong was gone. He'd found out that he was a suspect in Belinda's murder. Back in Lubbock, as Watson gathered more information, a picture of Belinda's last days became clearer. It had been 2 years since anyone had seen her. That's when some folks heard she'd gone camping with Armstrong. He liked to camp in Yellow House Canyon. It was a remote place that he knew well.
What's going on front, all right? I'll catch up with you, okay? All right, well, come on.
People mentioned that he carried a large hunting knife almost everywhere he went. The pieces were fitting together. It seemed that a bitter Armstrong had planned to take Belinda to this remote canyon and get rid of her for good. He thought no one would find her remains. After Belinda's death, he told a girlfriend he had nightmares about stabbing someone in the back. Based on the evidence, Watson obtained a warrant for Troy Armstrong's arrest, but he still had no information on his whereabouts. More than a year later, in January 1996, Watson received a tip. He found out that Armstrong was on the road with a truck driver buddy who was hauling for a company in California. Watson quickly contacted the trucking company. He discovered that their trucks were equipped with a global positioning system called GPS. A transponder on each truck bounced a signal off a satellite, telling the company where it was at all times. They informed him that the truck he was looking for was now traveling through Nebraska. Within minutes, Watson got the Nebraska State Police on the other line and asked them to set up a roadblock. They dispatched several cars to intercept the truck. As the police waited, they maintained contact with Watson and the trucking company, keeping tabs on the truck's whereabouts at all times. They knew just when to expect it. When the truck came barreling down the highway, the driver saw the roadblock ahead. He tried to escape, but the police sprang into action. Once the truck was halted, the police moved in. Hiding inside was Troy Armstrong. He was arrested for the murder of Belinda Tillery. By now, evidence against him had mounted. A former girlfriend and others admitted that he had confessed to killing Tillery. On December 5th, 1996, Armstrong was convicted for murder and sentenced to life in prison. Karen Taylor's lifelike reconstruction of Belinda K. Tillery was the key to solving a difficult case. Without it, the victim would never have been identified, and the killer never brought to justice. Like the artist she was trained to be, Taylor relies on pen and paper to capture likenesses. Elsewhere, scientists are beginning to apply digital technology to achieve a similar goal. At Colorado State University in Fort Collins, they're developing equipment to match faces to skulls with laser beam accuracy. Mechanical engineering professor Patrick Fitzhorn and a graduate student combined computer-aided design with laser technology. They created a system that scans three-dimensional objects and reconstructs them in a computer.
So what this machine can do is build a three-dimensional surface mesh, computer surface mesh, of a human skull that we can then play with on the computer. We can scale it up and down, we can move it through space.
As the skull rotates slowly on the platter, a laser beam strikes it at 10,000 to 50,000 points. A sensor measures the distance the beam travels as it reflects off each point. The results are fed into a computer that creates a digital version of the skull. The image is virtual, but its application is real.
And obviously what we want to do with it then at that point is to fix it in space, to take a scanned facial photograph and to map the photograph on the skull to see whether there's a match or not.
A photograph of the would-be owner of the skull is also scanned. The digital photo can be cleaned up and sharpened. Here, Fitzhorn made the photograph semi-transparent so he could superimpose it over the skull. Now he can compare their features.
But here you can see the teeth in here. There's the bridge of the nose. Here are the eyes. There's the eyeball in its orb. There's the other eyeball in its orb. There's the end of the cheekbone here. The jaw line down in here.
Currently, a forensic artist relies on his best guess to determine whether a photograph matches a skull. He takes measurements and superimposes a photograph over a skull. But if the picture was taken from an odd angle, it could distort the results.
The mouth doesn't match up. And now what we're seeing is how the skull is oriented. You can see how it's rotated in here with respect to the photograph. So here, this is the plane that the photograph is in, and you can see the skewing of the skull with respect to it. Again, trying to line the skull up in orientation with respect to the way the face was oriented when the camera photograph was taken.
Fitzhorn can rotate the skull and reorient the scanned facial photograph to minimize the distortion. Some photos aren't clear enough or are too distorted to enhance, defying efforts to make a match that's 100% certain. But Fitzhorn is convinced that his method is much more precise, less subjective than previous methods.
But one of the things that I'm really excited about is the potential to take 4 or 5 points on the skull, to take 4 or 5 matching points on the face, and actually attempt to compute whether or not there's a match. What we'd like to be able to do is numerically compute this fit on the computer, and then be able to say something like, this is a 95% probability of match, or this is a 35% probability of match.
As Patrick Fitzhorn and his colleagues perfect their computer face matching system, forensic artists in Louisiana are on a different mission. Instead of applying digital technology to identify the dead, they're hoping to use it to find the living. In this case, a girl who's been missing for over 20 years. In 1976, in a small town in Louisiana, a family argument turned sour. It wasn't the first time Geneva Martin and her teenage daughter argued. But what started out as a typical mother-daughter conflict soon turned into a 21-year ordeal for Geneva Martin.
She was 16 years old, you know. She let her opinion be known, and I let my opinion be known, and she wasn't any more wrong than I was.
The argument ended as many before. The two went back to their chores without saying a word to each other. Then Donna decided to leave.
Bye, Mom.
She said she was going to her grandmother's house. It was 2:30 p.m. By 5, she hadn't returned, so her concerned mother went looking for her at her grandmother's. But Donna wasn't there. Her grandmother said Donna had gone next door to play cards with her Aunt Peggy.
Well, didn't think anything about it, went back home. When she wasn't home at 9 o'clock, we went to Peggy's and there was no Donna.
Donna Martin had run away from home before, but this time it seemed like she wasn't coming back. Despite many attempts to find her, almost a year passed before Geneva Martin heard any news of her daughter. Then, one of Donna's friends told Geneva she had picked up Donna on the road and given her a ride to an apartment she was sharing in Baton Rouge. Geneva, desperately wanting to patch things up with her daughter, went to find her. But when she got there, the apartment was vacant. All that remained was Donna's name on the mailbox. The manager confirmed that Donna had been living there.
Excuse me, I took a picture of Donna to her, and she told me, yes, this was the young girl that had lived in the apartment with another married couple. From there, we found nothing.
Despite all she did to find her daughter, the trail remained cold for more than 20 years. Today, Geneva Martin hopes researchers at Louisiana State University will help heat it up again. Forensic anthropologist Mary Manheim and forensic artist Eileen Barrow use computers to simulate the aging process. If they can produce an accurate likeness of Donna Martin today at age 37, her mother may have a chance of finding her. LSU's Forensic Anthropology and Computer Enhancement Services, or FACES, is an ambitious program that's collecting data on the subtleties of the human face. Among its objectives, to develop precise standards of measurement for tissue thickness on the human skull. The information is used by forensic artists trying to build faces from bare bones. Until now, they relied on measurements based on cadavers. Manheim believes that using live subjects will produce much more accurate measurements. By using living models, Mannheim can select from a much broader and more complete statistical range. Though subjects remain anonymous, their age, sex, race, height, weight, and other personal information becomes part of the computer's database. To measure tissue thickness, she uses an ultrasound scanner, like the ones used to show a fetus in the womb. The scanner bounces sound waves off the skull. By measuring the time it takes for waves to return, a computer calculates the exact depth of the tissue from skin to bone. The process is repeated at 19 points across the skull.
We've scanned over 400 and almost 500 people now, and those range in age from 2 years of age to approximately 74 years of age. There are many different sizes, many different racial groups, so we will separate these out, height, weight, age, etc., and we will produce standards.
Mannheim has scanned the faces of generations of the same family. The data will show how family resemblances change over time. Mannheim and her colleagues are also using computers to show what a missing child's face might look like as it grows older. With young children, the first step is stretching the child's features to reflect growth of the skull. In this case, a 5-year-old child disappeared and has been missing 5 years. Barrow renders the child at age 10. The computer stretching tool divides the face into a grid.
And you pull each intersection of that grid down just a few steps. All right, so then that's the stretch. When we age a child, of course, the first thing we need is a picture of the child and a picture of her father and mother, or a sibling, or whoever the parent or the sibling might be that she looks most like.
The face can now be merged with the faces of her immediate family to create a composite image. With the click of a mouse, Barrow brings the missing child's features to the front.
To retain her particular look, the eyes and eyebrows, we would bring back a little bit of the shape of her nose and a little bit of the shape of her mouth. And then we would bring back or bring to the foreground her father's teeth, since she is, in this particular picture, the child had been missing for 5 years. So we were progressing her from 5 years old to about 10. So by that time, her teeth would have, of course, baby teeth would be gone and she would have permanent teeth, so we used the father's teeth to put in the picture.
The computer makes the manipulations easily, but Barrow must rely on her own judgment to decide which features to alter. Will the child look like a parent or more like her sibling? It's a question she'll need to answer when aging Donna Martin. Creating an image of what she might look like today will pose an extraordinary challenge. She'll have to be aged 21 years. Donna's face won't be stretched because at age 16 her face was fully developed.
All right.
Barrow will concentrate on other techniques. First, photographs of family members close to the age Donna would be today are scanned into the computer. Because family members tend to age alike, this will help guide Barrow as she makes decisions about aging Donna. By studying the photographs, Barrow can begin to see at what stage the relatives begin to show crow's feet or lines around the mouth, and how severe they might be. She can also see when chins begin to droop or when necks begin to sag.
She really did not look very much at all like her sisters, which I expected that she would. And she really didn't have a lot of resemblance to her mother. So we had no pictures of her father at that age, so I decided that the best thing to do would be to try to merge her with her mother.
To merge the image of Donna Martin at 16 with her mother at age 40, Barrow must first align and resize the photographs. The photograph of Donna is a 3/4 view. To align it with her mother's, Barrow must adjust it to show a frontal view.
Now what happens here is that the mother's picture is quite a bit bigger than hers. So then what I have to do is size the picture of the mother. And that means reducing its size to try to fit the other one.
Barrow patiently and meticulously merges the photographs. She makes sure Donna's features remain dominant, while taking some physical cues from her mother's image. Then she erases Donna's hairstyle at age 16, so a more mature style can be added. Finally, the transformation is complete. The 16-year-old Donna Martin has become a woman of 37.
Well, it looks a lot like our family. Oddly enough, it looks like my husband's family rather than myself.
Geneva Martin will distribute the image of Donna nationwide. She hopes it will finally reunite her with her daughter and put to rest that fateful argument that's gone unresolved for 21 years. The work of one forensic artist may lead a daughter back to her mother. In one of forensic art's most acclaimed cases, another artist used his skills to lead police to a killer. In 1971, the quiet surface of a prosperous community was shattered by a brutal crime. A successful accountant, John Emil List, lived with his family in a mansion in Westfield, New Jersey. Then his fortunes waned. So in November of 1971, List began a new life. But first, he had to end his current one. He killed his entire family, his wife, 3 children, and his elderly mother. Then he dragged the bodies into the ballroom and arranged them neatly in a row. He tried to clean as much of their blood off the floor as he could. He also sat down to write a long letter of confession. When he finished, he left his house for the last time. A month passed before the Westfield police received a call from a woman concerned about her neighbors. She hadn't seen them home, and their lights had been on day and night until one by one they'd burned out.
I'm back either. I think we're going to have to make entry.
When the police arrived, they found an unattended mansion in need of repair. They looked around the outside of the house until they found an open window. When they entered, they had no idea what was waiting for them. The air was cold and filled with the odor of decay. They kept searching through the darkness until they finally came upon the List family in the ballroom, still neatly laid out, dead for a month. It was one of the most grotesque murders Westfield police had ever seen. When detectives were called in, they found the guns List had used and his letter of confession. List was an active member in the church and addressed the letter to his pastor. In it, he explained that he was no longer able to support his family and pay for the mansion his wife had insisted they buy. He was worried his family faced a life of humiliation on welfare. He was also upset his wife and children had stopped attending church. He felt his daughter had taken a misguided interest in acting, which threatened to deny her status as one of God's children. At least, he concluded, I'm certain they've all gone to heaven now. After slaying his family, List left his car at New York's Kennedy Airport and took a bus heading out of town. He hid his crime carefully. A month passed before anyone noticed his disappearance. Police and the FBI conducted a worldwide search, but nothing turned up. 18 years later, New Jersey detective Bernard Tracy was still on the case. He would make one last effort to find John Emil List by turning to the experts who combine art and science to age the human face. An accurate portrait of John List as a middle-aged man might alert someone somewhere to turn him in.
One thing I can tell you about the John List investigation, back in 1971, this was a state-of-the-art investigation.
Tracy was assigned to the case in 1974, taking over from detectives who'd been on the case for 3 years. The investigation was one of the most thorough ever conducted by New Jersey police. In their search for clues, detectives performed psychological profiles of List and his family.
We did little profiles on the victims. That was John List, his oldest son. His son Frederick, who was 13 at the time. And his daughter Patricia was 16.
Though the case had cooled by 1974, Tracy was convinced John List was still alive.
The common case is that when a person kills people close to them, they kill themselves shortly thereafter. If he wasn't found shortly thereafter dead, a victim of suicide, then I believed he would still be alive. It was just a question of where.
In an effort to find out, Tracy persuaded a television producer to include the case in a series on fugitives from justice. The producer, in turn, enlisted the expertise of Philadelphia forensic artist Frank Bender to sculpt the face of List as he might appear at age 63. The sculpture would appear on television for millions of people to see. If Bender could produce a good likeness of John List 18 years after the crime, he might finally be found. To help guide his imagination as he adds years to a face, Bender carefully reviews the subject's background and his habits, knowing they're unlikely to change. Behavior can influence how a person ages. Before starting the List project, Bender thoroughly researched his subject. He discussed List's psychological aspects with forensic psychologists and police experts.
If you mow your lawn in a suit and tie, you're not relaxed. It's about staying in control. He'll still be wearing probably the same clothes, the same type of bow tie. None of that's going to change.
You know, I've been going to a church on Sundays, and as often as I can, to try to get the feel of like what his environment is really like.
Any clue police gave him about List's life helped Bender form an image of how he may have aged.
Lifestyle, hairstyle, hobbies, hereditary factors. Then I either do my own psychological profile, as I've done in numerous cases, or as in this case, bring in a forensic psychologist and go back and forth with this individual, walk around the town for maybe 2 or 3 days, really get to know this person, put my feet in their shoes, and in a sense kind of become the person so I can stay one step ahead of them visually.
To obtain a scientific outlook on the aging process, Bender visited the medical school of the University of Pennsylvania. Here he consulted with Dr. Scott Bartlett, an expert in cranial and facial surgery and in repairing congenital deformities of the face. Dr. Bartlett's knowledge of the aging process, as reflected in the human face, made him a valuable ally. Bender was curious about the appearance of a scar behind List's ear from an operation.
The scar went from his ear down to at least his collar.
I would guess that, you know, drawing the ear in something like this, more to the side of the head, and I would guess that there's bound to be, if he had an open mastoid operation, that he might have a fairly significant scar back here. Invisible to
Dr.
the eye.
Bartlett pointed out that as List aged, wrinkles and folds in his neck could make the scar less noticeable.
I see, okay.
The two men also discussed how aging affects the eyelids and brows, which can change significantly over 18 years.
The canthal attachment here, which is the outer and the inner corners of the eye, I don't think change a lot. I think what we're seeing here is this hooding, this laxity of the soft tissue that's now falling over and giving this a downward slant, down and outward slant to the eye opening here, as opposed to this fresh up and out slant that you see in youth.
Ultimately, Frank Bender would apply his own intuition to what he learned about the case. Bender has been a sculptor for more than 30 years, showing his work in galleries and museums all over the United States.
Most of my studies are human behavior. I'm a people person. When I go to the beach, I don't look at the ocean as much as I like studying the people on the beach, how they interact, what they look like, the differences, what makes each person an individual.
Beginning his sculpture of John List, Bender had a problem. He had to construct a three-dimensional model, yet the only available photograph of List was a frontal view. There were no pictures showing a three-quarter or side view. Bender would rely on his experience as a commercial photographer to study the photograph and analyze its three dimensions based on highlight and shadow.
Now, with fugitives, you have old photographs. The most important thing with a fugitive, I found, is to stay within the perimeters of the skull. The same as facial reconstruction. This is where the similarities lie. If you elongate the head, you theoretically are changing the shape of the skull, the foundation underneath.
As he worked on his sculpture, he checked his work with acetate overlays made from the 20-year-old photograph.
I take an old photograph, enlarge it to what I feel would be life-size, do acetate overlays, and then lie it over the sculpture as I'm working on it to make sure that I'm within the perimeters of the skull.
As a face began to emerge from clay, Bender delved ever deeper into the mind of John List.
I felt that John List wanted to kind of be, in a sense, a generic individual. You know, wanted to blend in, didn't want to create waves. Wanted some peace in his life, which he never got from his wife. And this started building up his anxiety. I really believe he tried to get this through the church and was getting it. But when he came back home, it was complete overload.
Once the preliminary sculpture was complete, Bender and his assistant made a plaster cast.
That's good.
Little by little, Bender's sculpture took shape. By now, Bender was more familiar with List's face than with his own. As the bust of the fugitive emerged from its mold, Frank Bender was ready to add the final details to the face of a killer. John Emil List, after murdering his family, had evaded capture for 18 years. Whether police could find him would depend on Frank Bender's intuitive ability to imagine John List in his early 60s. Bender guessed that List's hairline continued to recede, as it had begun to do in his earlier photograph. He added jowls based on his assessment of List's lifestyle.
He wasn't an exercise type person. He was a potato and meat type person. As far as the eyes, you know, you can see where he's starting to get some lines. I look a little tired. You see, I sculpted the tie and the shirt and the coat, you know, the suit coat on him, because he's always going to be wearing that.
Bender sensed that the years of hiding what he had done would take a toll on List. This influenced his decision to turn the corners of his mouth down.
You can see the corners of the mouth going down here rather than up like the photograph, which I'll bring right over. And you can see how they turned up. After 20 years, I'm having them go down. Not his whole mouth going down, just the corners. Again, not only aging, but the fear of getting caught.
As a final touch, Bender selected eyeglasses for the aged List. He searched for a style that would define a man who killed his entire family, yet called himself a Christian. He decided on thick black frames, thinking List might go for an austere, authoritative look that would discourage others from prying into his past. Now his sculpture was ready for the nation to see. On May 21st, 1989, millions of people across the United States saw Frank Bender's sculpture of John Emile List. Was the likeness good enough to catch the killer?
Oh my God, that's Bob Clark.
Ricky!
Yeah? Is that Mr. Clark? Yeah, it looks like
One of the viewers was a woman from Denver, Colorado. When she saw the bust, she called in. She said it looked just like her former neighbor, Robert P. Clark, who moved to Virginia.
Good morning. We're with the FBI. Yes, can you direct us to the office of Robert Clark, please?
Yes, Mr. Clark's office is down.
Following up on the tip, FBI agents found a man who called himself Robert Clark at an office in Richmond, Virginia. After years of getting away with a horrible murder, List was about to see his last days as a free man. When the agents approached him, he insisted he was not John List. But on his neck was the telltale scar, and his fingerprints matched those of the killer. With that, the agents had proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Robert P. Clark and John Emile List were in fact the same man. Since the murders, John List had remarried and recreated his life as an accountant, confident that the crimes he'd committed in 1971 would never come back to haunt him. For Detective Bernard Tracy, it was the end of an incredible odyssey. A cold-blooded murderer finally captured after 18 years. By all accounts, the resemblance between the bust created by Frank Bender and the actual John List was uncanny.
I think the bust was something that if a person looked at that and had any doubt that that would be the straw that broke the camel's back, that would be the one. If they had any hesitation about calling and then they saw the bust, that would be the one that would take them over the edge and say, I got a call, this is him.
John Emile List was convicted of murdering his family and sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences. He and his unsuspecting new wife were attending a church function on the night Frank Bender's sculpture aired nationwide. As a result, they missed the show that gave John List yet another new start in life in New Jersey's State Penitentiary. Armed with photographs, scientific data, psychological profiles, and artistic talent, forensic artists breathe new life into unsolved cases. Using their unique knowledge of human physiology and human nature, they can help locate the missing, track murderers through time, and bring killers to justice. A motel clerk disappears, leaving behind a trail of blood. Investigators have their suspect, but without a victim, what can they charge him with? A shooting is reported, but investigators have no proof that it really occurred.
What do you have on the victim?
Until they can sift fact from fiction, they haven't got a case. Is a missing sofa the key to a woman's disappearance? The prosecution can't rest until it can make sense of a series of odd clues. Murder is usually the most obvious of crimes. The victims' bodies mute witnesses to violence. But their silent testimony may go unheard when they disappear without a trace. Memphis, Tennessee, a thriving southern city. Home of Beale Street, the Blues, and Elvis Presley. But in 1997, it played host to a deadly mystery. In the early morning hours of February 8th, a man arrived at a Memphis motel. He became concerned when calls to the front desk went unanswered. He went to check it out.
Hello?
The clerk appeared to be missing.
Hello?
He didn't see anyone in the lobby, but there was blood on the counter. The office security door was open, and he noticed more blood on the frame. Convinced something was wrong, he left and called police. When Memphis police arrived, they discovered blood outside the motel entrance. Smearing indicated something had been dragged across the pavement. They found more clues inside. While the office showed no sign of forced entry, the cash register was open and empty. But a purse lying undisturbed nearby caught their attention. They didn't believe a woman would willingly leave it behind. The wallet inside still contained money, as well as a checkbook, credit cards, and driver's license in the name of Ricky Ellsworth. Alerted by police, the motel manager arrived and confirmed that Ricky Ellsworth was the clerk on duty. She said Ricky lived nearby with her husband, Don, and 2 children. A trusted, reliable employee, she wasn't the sort to just leave in the middle of her shift. Circumstances of the crime suggested more than robbery. Police suspected the clerk had been abducted. As police processed the scene, other significant details began to emerge. The office security door was equipped with a keypad, but it was open and showed no sign of tampering. Either someone had known the code or the clerk had unlocked the door. To investigators, that suggested Ricky Ellsworth might have known her abductor.
So fingerprints, those are going to be fingerprints. Let's go check back.
Although police had begun to suspect foul play, nothing prepared them for what they found in an adjacent bathroom. There were signs of a desperate struggle and much more blood. The running sink contained a small flashlight, and the toilet seat had been ripped from its hinges. Wet, blood-tinged sheets indicated someone had tried to clean the room. Not only had Ricky Ellsworth disappeared, but it now seemed she'd been seriously injured. Captain R.G. Moore, who led the crime scene unit, feared the worst.
When we don't have a body and we don't know exactly what happened, we'd handle it just like it's going to be a homicide case. We process the scene, we collect our blood sample, we collect all the evidence we can find from the scene, and just keep it until we see what we got.
Investigators hoped the evidence would lead them to Ricky. A squad car brought the victim's husband, Don Ellsworth, to the motel. He said he and Ricky were happily married. He told police his wife was a kind person who worked with a Christian prison ministry in her spare time. Every Christmas, she baked pies for the prisoners. But Ellsworth said their marriage hadn't always been so tranquil. They'd once separated for 2 years, and she'd gotten involved with a man who assaulted her and went to prison for it. Ellsworth said the man's name was Michael Rimmer. After finishing at the scene, the investigators returned to the station to conduct a background check on Michael Rimmer. What they found in the files was chilling. Rimmer was a high school dropout with a history of drug problems and violence. In 1989, he was convicted of robbing and brutally assaulting Ricky Ellsworth. Details of Rimmer's previous assault on Ricky raised Detective Robert Shemwell's suspicions.
His actions at that crime basically mirrored what was happening here at the motel with the cleaning up, or attempt to clean up the evidence. We immediately began looking for Michael Rimmer.
Meanwhile, detectives narrowed the time frame for Ricky's disappearance. They found a couple who had checked in with her at 1:15 a.m. But when 2 others tried to check out around 2:30, she wasn't there. Detectives located a witness who said he pulled into the motel at approximately 2:15, hoping to rent a room. But he saw a man with bloody knuckles behind the counter and left without registering. He also noticed a 4-door maroon car backed up to the curb, its trunk and doors open. Based on his description, police put together a composite of the man at the motel. Using an identikit, a collection of facial parts and features that can be assembled as needed, the suspect's face came together. It resembled Michael Rimmer. Detectives then asked the witness to look through an album of more than 50 mugshots, including Rimmer's. Their hopes were dashed when he couldn't positively identify Rimmer as the man with the bloody knuckles. Detectives learned from a co-worker that Ricky had recently gotten a birthday card from a Michael in Mississippi. She took the card into the back office to read, but became angry and threw it away.
How you doing, sir?
It was becoming clear to detectives that if they wanted to find Ricky Ellsworth, they needed to find Michael Rimmer. They started at the auto repair shop where he worked. Nobody had seen him since Friday, the day before Ricky disappeared. He'd left his tools and paycheck behind. One more critical fact emerged.
When we got to talking to the employees there, this same maroon 4-door vehicle was described as being Michael Rimmer's car. So then we decided we need to track down and find out where Michael Rimmer got this 4-door maroon vehicle.
It wasn't registered to Rimmer. If it wasn't his, detectives wondered where he'd gotten it. His co-workers sent detectives to another friend of Rimmer's who told them that his own maroon 4-door car had been stolen a month earlier, shortly after he'd last seen Rimmer. After 4 days, Ricky Ellsworth was still missing, and so was Michael Rimmer.
How you doing, sir?
Hoping for a clue to his whereabouts, police questioned his brother. Richard Rimmer said he'd last seen Michael on the morning of February 9th, just hours after Ricky Ellsworth disappeared. Michael had seemed exhausted when he arrived in the maroon car around 9:30 a.m. He asked Richard if he knew how to remove a blood stain from the back seat. Then, Michael pulled a muddy shovel from the car and scraped mud from his boots. Richard also told police that Michael claimed Ricky bought the car for him. She had visited Rimmer in prison after he claimed he'd found God. And Richard knew the two had met after his release. But somewhere along the line, the friendship soured. By now, 2 weeks had passed, and still nobody had seen or heard from Ricky Ellsworth. Detectives had lost hope of finding her alive, and their prime suspect, Michael Rimmer, still eluded them. They would have to find him and the stolen car if they had any chance of proving murder.
I issued a theft of property warrant on Michael Rimmer and indicated in that warrant that when he was located, or if that vehicle was located, that he was to be held for the Memphis Homicide Unit and processed.
Detectives got a promising lead from one of Rimmer's former cellmates. He said Rimmer spoke of killing Ricky and burying her in Mississippi after he got out of prison. Rimmer's former girlfriend told detectives of a wooded area called Plantation Point near Arca-Butler Lake in Mississippi. It was 45 minutes from Memphis. She said Rimmer liked to go there. Detectives headed to Plantation Point. They combed the area on foot, but didn't find anything. Then they called in blackwater divers from the Shelby County Search and Rescue Unit. Specially trained to operate by touch in dark, murky black water, the divers searched the lake. They didn't find anything either. Detectives were thoroughly frustrated. They chased down every witness and lead, but were no closer to solving the case or finding Ricky Ellsworth or Michael Rimmer. Now they'd run out of options. In Memphis, nearly a month had passed with no progress in the potential homicide case. In early March, detectives got a phone call from Johnson County, Indiana. A sheriff's deputy there had stopped a maroon car for speeding. When he ran a check on the license plate, he discovered the car was stolen and there was a warrant for the driver. Michael Rimmer, sought for crimes including robbery and possible murder, had been arrested during a routine traffic stop. Detectives flew to Indiana, prepared to finally question Rimmer and examine the car for evidence. After obtaining a warrant, forensic investigators with the Johnson County Crime Unit searched the car. They hoped for solid evidence, but never expected to find what they did.
Numerous receipts, hotel receipts, pawn shop receipts, restaurant receipts, showing Mike's every step from the day Ricky came up missing till his actual apprehension.
Investigators tested the stained back seat for human blood. Results were positive. It was their first physical evidence to suggest a connection between Rimmer and the crime. Memphis detectives questioned Michael Rimmer over the next 2 days. He denied stealing the car or having anything to do with Ricky's disappearance. So far, all their evidence was circumstantial. Without Ricky's body, there was only one way to link Rimmer to her murder.
The blood from the rear of the vehicle Michael Rimmer was occupying and the blood from the scene matched. We had a problem though. We had to determine or show somehow that that blood was Ricky Ellsworth's blood.
They had one chance, a reverse paternity DNA test which uses the combined DNA traits passed on from parents to determine the DNA characteristics of their children. Forensic scientists compared blood from Ricky's mother to samples from the crime scene and the maroon car. They matched. The test established a 16 million to 1 probability that blood from the car and motel came from an offspring of Ricky's mother. It was the final link police needed to prove murder. Michael Rimmer's guilt was written in blood. Based on evidence, police believe they know what happened on February 8th. Michael Rimmer drove to the motel sometime around 1:30 a.m., knowing Ricky Ellsworth would be alone. When he arrived, she let him into the office. There, Rimmer exploded into violence, attacking her, then wrapping her body in sheets. Afterward, he tried to clean the room, but gave up and left the sink running. Dragging Ricky to his car, Rimmer made his escape. Although her body was never found, police believe Ricky Ellsworth is buried somewhere near Arca Butler Lake. Michael Rimmer was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. While no body was ever found in the Rimmer case, police used blood evidence to prove murder. But in Cleveland, Ohio, police would have to build a case on even less. On Saturday, December 15, 1984, Cleveland police were called to the home of Ernestine Campbell. She reported that her brother, Henry, was missing, and she feared for his life because she'd heard he'd been shot and his body hidden in an alley. She told police she'd last seen Henry the night before when he'd left home for a nearby after-hours spot. Officers searched the alley, but didn't find a body. In fact, they didn't find any signs of foul play. They drove through the neighborhood, but didn't see anything unusual. There was no sign of Henry Campbell, and nothing to indicate a violent crime had occurred. Officers canvassed the area, talking to residents who might have seen or heard something the night before. One witness claimed she heard shots and saw men running near the club. Another recalled hearing shots, but couldn't provide any other details. Still others confirmed shots were fired, but nobody admitted seeing anything. Police were frustrated. They had reports of gunfire and a murder, but couldn't find the purported victim. Homicide Detective John Qualey, the lead investigator, recalls the odd circumstances of the case.
Well, usually we're called to the scene of a homicide where we have a victim laying on the street or in a house, but we have a victim. And a lot of times we'll be able to get the weapon used in a crime. With this incident, a murder was reported, we went to the scene, we didn't have a body. We couldn't find the body, we couldn't find any evidence of blood, or we didn't have a weapon. It was kind of starting without anything to work with.
Police needed more information, so they returned to the Campbell house. Ernestine gave them a picture of Henry and more details. She'd heard that some people claimed they'd seen Clarence Barnes shoot her brother in the back. She said Barnes ran the after-hours club in his home and that there was bad blood between him and Henry.
Hi, Miss Richardson. Sorry.
At the station, people who had been at the club that night began coming forward. A woman named Jacqueline Richardson told investigators she saw Campbell at the club and that he argued with Barnes.
Now, you understand? Not me now. Yeah, it has to be that way. Out of here now.
When Campbell left, Barnes, who had a gun, followed him outside.
Get off me, man.
She said the two men were joined by a third and walked out of her sight. Shortly after that, a woman ran into the club screaming that there'd been a shooting and Henry Campbell was injured. Richardson went outside, where a passerby told her some men were chasing and shooting at another. She said she didn't see anything and returned to the club. Barnes was already there, asking everyone to leave. As the search continued for evidence of murder, Victor Santiago told police what he knew.
No.
He was the third man Jacqueline Richardson had described, and his account took up where hers left off.
You don't care. You don't care. I don't care who your boys are.
He said he'd seen the two men arguing outside the club and heard Barnes order Campbell to leave. According to Santiago, Campbell caught up with him a few moments later. As they walked down the street, he heard a shot and Campbell fell forward. Santiago said he took cover, then watched Barnes fire 3 more shots at the prostrate Campbell. Police now had 2 eyewitness accounts, but still no evidence of a homicide. Henry Campbell had disappeared, and detectives had 2 eyewitness accounts of murder, but no body and no evidence. Several residents claimed Clarence Barnes bragged that he'd burned Campbell's body and that nobody would ever find him. Investigators brought Barnes to the station for questioning.
Just take the chair on your left.
He admitted having words with Campbell and asking him to leave, but said he didn't know what happened after that. He denied having anything to do with Campbell's disappearance. When police asked Barnes what he did for a living, he told them he worked at the Animal Resource Center at a local university. That immediately rang a bell in Qualey's mind, and he called Barnes's supervisor.
We asked him if he had an incinerator in the school. And he said, oh, yes. And we asked him how big it was. He said it was big enough to incinerate a steer. We told him then that we were investigating a homicide and that possibly there may be human remains in the incinerator, and asked him if he would seal the room. He did.
The next morning, detectives and a team of forensic investigators went to the Animal Resource Center, believing they might find the remains of Henry Campbell. While the facility director arranged access to the incinerator, the security chief showed them surveillance video from the night Campbell disappeared. It showed Barnes arriving around 3:30 a.m. He backed into the receiving area, which was approximately 15 feet from the incinerator entrance. Police could see him carrying something toward the incinerator room, but couldn't identify what it was.
The picture then jumped away and came back, and the next picture was the incinerator door open and Clarence pushing a cart in there. You could not see what was on the cart, but we knew he was in the incinerator room at that hour.
When investigators saw the incinerator, they knew they were in for a long, complicated task. Dr. Elizabeth Balraj, coroner of Cuyahoga County, recalls the challenge.
There were 100 gallons of cremated ashes containing the remains from various animals, and we had to sift through those and find a very small amount of human bones.
If human bones were to be found at all. The team began the painstaking process of sifting through the incinerator contents. Using a fine mesh screen, they collected fragments of bone and other unburned debris. Though most of the fragments were tiny and charred, some appeared to be human, including a vertebra, mandible, and part of a pelvis. They also found a piece of melted lead. Its size and mass were consistent with a .38 caliber bullet. It was the first solid evidence of murder. Although investigators believed they'd found Henry Campbell, their case would go up in smoke if they couldn't prove it. They turned to Dr. C. Owen Lovejoy, a biological anthropologist at Kent State University and an expert at identifying altered or damaged remains. He applied his skills to making a positive identification from the incomplete and severely damaged bone fragments. Lovejoy concurred with Dr. Balraj that approximately 160 of the recovered bones were human. The next step was determining whether they came from one person and whether that person was Henry Campbell. The process would be complicated by their condition.
Here, the pieces of the puzzle, all of the edges had been frayed, as you will, by the cremation process. And so none of the pieces fit together, and we had to look at them in an isolated state.
After a thorough inventory of the fragments, Lovejoy determined that portions of an entire skeleton were present. No bones were duplicated. That told Lovejoy the remains came from a single individual. But was it Henry Campbell? Next, he would try to establish specifics about the individual. Investigators had recovered part of the pelvis, which is diagnostic for both sex and age. Lovejoy concluded the remains belonged to a male, approximately Henry Campbell's age. While detectives were closer to proving they'd found Campbell, they needed positive identification. But Lovejoy couldn't give them that, not without more to go on.
Whenever we have a candidate individual that we believe the skeletal remains might match, what we do is we try to get a premortem X-ray.
Investigators delivered existing X-rays of Henry Campbell to Dr. Lovejoy. Could they help him prove murder? As Cleveland detectives sought to identify the bones found in the incinerator, Dr. Owen Lovejoy compared post-mortem X-rays and bone fragments with Campbell's radiographs. He focused on the skull, hand, and mandible. One recovered cranial fragment had a BB embedded in it. That matched an X-ray taken when Henry Campbell had accidentally been shot years earlier. Lovejoy also identified shared characteristics between Campbell's other X-rays and corresponding bone fragments. But he found the most compelling correlations in the lower mandible, or jawbone.
And the outline of that jaw, the details of the bone structure, and the details of the root areas where the teeth had been prior to death, all were configured in such a way that they indicated that this was a positive identification.
Since the jaw figured so prominently in that identification, Dr. Elizabeth Robinson, the team's forensic odontologist, reviewed Lovejoy's conclusions. In her opinion, two significant findings bolstered his analysis. The end of the jawbone was flat, a unique defect present in Henry Campbell's jaw. A second anomaly, an area of intense calcification, clinched the identification.
And it was in exactly the same area that it was on the postmortem as on the antemortem. It was also only 5 millimeters in size. In other words, it's the exact same size, same area, and on both X-rays.
With the positive identification, investigators had literally pulled proof of a homicide from the ashes. On December 21st, less than 1 week after Henry Campbell was reported missing, Barnes was officially charged with murder. Based on the evidence, police believe Barnes followed Campbell from his after-hours club, shot him, then hid his body. Later that night, Barnes took Campbell's body to the Animal Resource Center, where he incinerated it. In April of 1985, Clarence Barnes pled guilty to the murder of Henry Campbell. He received 15 years to life for aggravated murder. In Cleveland, police had to sift their case from a pile of ashes. In Maryland, investigators followed a winding trail of clues to capture a killer. Rockville, Maryland, August 10, 1988. 17-year-old Kai Lau returned early from a California vacation at the behest of a family friend to check on his mother, Lisa Tu. He hadn't heard from her in nearly a month, and others told him they hadn't heard from her either. That wasn't like his mother. When he and his mother's friend found no sign of Lisa in the house, they contacted police. They went to the Special Investigations Office at the Montgomery County Police Department to report her missing.
Detective Turner?
Yes.
Hi.
Kai informed officers that nobody had seen or heard from his mother for a month.
Yes, the reason I called is...
He said that his stepfather, Gregory II, might know more, but he was overseas on business and Kai didn't know how to reach him. Before Gregory left, he told friends that Lisa had flown to San Francisco to visit a friend in the hospital. Kai said it was unusual for his mother to go away without telling anyone except Gregory. Police promised to investigate.
Anything look suspicious up there?
They began by contacting the airlines. Records confirmed that a one-way ticket had been purchased for LL2 on July 13th. The destination was San Francisco via a connecting flight in Los Angeles. The ticket to Los Angeles had been used, but not the one for San Francisco. It appeared Lisa, too, wasn't planning to come back.
This is the one.
That was her right, but the detectives needed to make one more call. They contacted the friend Lisa was supposed to be visiting in San Francisco. She said she hadn't been in the hospital, wasn't expecting Lisa, and hadn't talked to her in months. Now, detectives began to consider whether Lisa too intended to disappear, or if there might be a more sinister explanation. Detective Roger Thompson worked the case.
It was not the normal missing person case where we know somebody's missing for a particular reason. They may not contact family members, but we sooner or later find them. This had some mystery to it.
To find out more, detectives spoke to several of Lisa's friends and learned the twos had been married nearly 10 years. It was the second marriage for both, and Kai Lau was Lisa's son from her previous marriage. The twos had enjoyed the good life. Gregory was a successful restaurateur. In fact, one of his restaurants had been a favorite of Washington's elite. But it hadn't lasted. He'd suffered business reversals and lost his restaurants. A commissioned sales job couldn't support the family's affluent lifestyle. Gregory and Lisa argued about money, and their marriage was rocky. Police also learned that Lisa was romantically involved with another man. Police questioned him at his office. He said he spoke to Lisa the afternoon of July 14th, the last day anyone saw or heard from her. He denied knowing anything about a trip to San Francisco and expressed concern over Lisa's sudden disappearance. He indicated Lisa's husband was suspicious about their relationship. When he passed a polygraph test, investigators believed he was telling the truth. Detectives checked out the family's finances and saw indications of serious problems. Gregory was $30,000 in debt. Detective Mike Turner realized too was under a lot of pressure.
Gregory was known to like to gamble, and we determined that he, through interviews with friends, had accrued some debt in gambling that he had not been able to pay. And this was another problem that arose with his relationship with Lisa.
Detectives also learned Lisa Too's bank and charge accounts had been inactive since early July. That didn't make sense if she was alive. They discovered that her husband, who was still unreachable on a business trip, would collect a $200,000 life insurance policy if anything happened to his wife. Detectives began to suspect that the couple's financial woes might spell more than a simple missing persons case. As the investigation continued, Lisa's son was doing a little detective work of his own. Kai Lau found his mother's address book in her bedroom. That was odd because she seldom went anywhere without it. He also noticed that furniture in the house was missing or rearranged. He called Detective Turner.
Hi, Detective Turner.
Kai returned to the police station and met with investigators.
Look, I've also got this withdrawal.
He had found that $44,000 had been withdrawn from a bank account Lisa kept for his education.
Yeah, almost enough for a college tuition.
And that wasn't all.
Like I said, the money.
Kai told police his stepfather's gun was missing, and a sleep sofa had disappeared. He said his mother often slept on it when she and Gregory weren't getting along. Kai also informed detectives that his stepfather, Gregory, was due back from his business trip that evening. By now, investigators had a lot of questions for Gregory, too. They met him at the airport and brought him to the police station.
Officer, have a seat right here.
He was concerned about his wife and was eager to help police. He told them he bought Lisa a plane ticket to San Francisco so she could visit a friend in the hospital. He said he drove her to Dulles International Airport the next day and watched her board the plane.
You wouldn't lie to us, would you, Mr. Two?
Absolutely not.
He claimed she called from Los Angeles and said she was awaiting the flight to San Francisco. He hadn't heard from her since. When they told him Lisa's friend wasn't sick and wasn't expecting her, he seemed surprised.
That's what Lisa told me. Well,
Then he offered another explanation. He claimed his wife was unhappy with her appearance and wanted plastic surgery. He said they'd argued about it in the past. He surmised that might have been the real reason for the trip. Lisa probably made up the story of a sick friend, realizing he wouldn't buy the ticket if he'd known the truth. When detectives inquired about the missing sofa, Two said it was infested with mice and he had it hauled away. He also said he threw the gun away after a well-publicized local incident where a homeowner shot some trespassers. He explained away the $30,000 debt as business and travel expenses. Two begged off further questions, saying he was tired from his long trip. Detectives agreed to continue the interview another day if Two would take a polygraph test. He agreed and promised to return the following Monday.
Sure, you're pretty good.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Gregory, too, didn't keep his appointment. He skipped town. To detectives, that seemed the act of a guilty man.
We then felt that the suspicions that the family had, that we had put together since the initiation of the investigation, now had come to fruition, and we were looking probably at a homicide.
Their suspicions about Gregory, too, grew even more when Kai brought them an Air Express letter from California. In it, Gregory claimed he was in Los Angeles looking for Lisa. If he didn't find her there, he planned to continue his search in San Francisco. Investigators considered the letter a self-serving excuse from a guilty man. But believing and proving are two different things. Without Lisa's body, there was no evidence she was dead. They began looking for proof in Gregory's story. Investigators followed up on Kai's tip about his missing college money and enlisted the help of the state's attorney's office. John McCarthy, deputy state attorney in Montgomery County, found Lisa had controlled it.
Gregory, too, cleaned out that account. We got bank photographs from the bank, and clear as day, you could see Gregory, too, stealing the $44,000 from that fund. And within a period of 10 days after he stole it, he had run through that money. It was gone.
Detective Turner re-examined the airline ticket to San Francisco. They learned it was possible for someone to check in, have the ticket marked, but not board the plane. He suspected Gregory, too, had done that, and that Lisa never boarded the plane. They contacted passengers who'd been on the flight. Then, Attorney McCarthy got a real break. A woman called to say she'd been on the plane with her husband and small child. While airborne, the couple took several photographs.
She says, well, I've got some pictures of the seat that Lisa, too, was supposed to be in on that plane from Washington to San Francisco, and she's not in those pictures. And she forwarded me those pictures, and one of the ways we were able to prove conclusively that Lisa was not on that plane that Gregory said she was on was with those pictures.
Detectives wanted to know more about the missing sofa sleeper. They wondered if Lisa's body was inside it when it was hauled away. They tracked down the men who picked it up. They remembered the couch because Gregory tipped them for carrying it out to the truck. They didn't notice anything unusual about it. Investigators traced it to the landfill, but that was a dead end. The sofa had already been ground up and buried. Detectives reasoned that Gregory might have gotten rid of the sofa because it contained proof of Lisa's death. If that were true, there could be other evidence at the residence. They obtained a search warrant to find out. An examination of Gregory's car uncovered incriminating evidence. Clumps of mud, weeds, and twigs were stuck in the undercarriage, indicating the car had been driven off-road. In the trunk, they found a plastic tarp, a carving knife, and a machete.
Mike, come over here. Look.
All of the items were clean, but they could have been used to dispose of a body. Inside the house, detectives found their first physical evidence of foul play. There were droplets of blood on a chair near the spot where the sofa had stood. But investigators suspected more might have been cleaned up. To find out, they processed the area with a Luma light, which makes blood that cannot be seen with the naked eye glow. They discovered blood spatters where the sofa had been, and it displayed a significant pattern.
We know that the couch was open at the time when this all occurred because there was no blood, swiping, or markings underneath the couch. It was a fold-away, opened-up couch, and when they put out the processing, you could see, basically see the outline of the couch opened up as a bed.
Investigators also found signs of smearing, evidence someone had tried to clean up the blood. While they were processing the scene, the phone rang. A car rental agency in Las Vegas was calling for Gregory II.
Yes.
The car he rented several days before was overdue. It was the brake police were looking for. Now they finally knew where II was, but they needed some help in capturing him.
What I would like you to do is, if he calls in about the car in the next few days, or brings the car in, try to stall him, or if he calls in, tell him that you would like to replace the car with another car because this one needs reservice or whatever reason you can think of, or it's going to be resold, but somehow get him to come to the rental office to get another car.
Hello, my name's Greg.
The plan worked.
Yes, mister, we have an upgrade for you. Just a minute, please.
Okay.
Yes, sir, I can
On
take you.
Saturday, September 10th, he arrived at the car rental office.
Yes, your car is ready.
It is?
Police arrested him on a fugitive warrant, nearly a month after he disappeared. Detectives Turner and Thompson flew to Las Vegas, where they began retracing II's activities since he fled Maryland. A matchbook in his hotel room led them to a Chinese restaurant. The manager recognized II from a photograph. She told investigators he had applied for a job, saying his wife was dead and he wanted to start a new life. On the job application, he gave his name as Greg Sen. When the detectives returned home with II, they called in a document examiner at the Maryland State Police Crime Lab. They knew Gregory had used aliases. They wanted to confirm whether the handwriting on the job application and other items he wrote matched the bank slip closing Kai Lau's college account. the stolen money would provide the motive for the more serious crime of suspected homicide. After providing known samples of Tu's writing, detectives awaited the results of the document examination. The job application, bank slip, and other documents were compared against Tu's handwriting. In making the comparison, factors such as writing style, speed, and pressure are all studied. Document examiner David Sexton explains.
And it's a combination of those characteristics as well as a combination of recognizable letter formations and that combination of characteristics that are unique to the individual's handwriting.
The writing on the job application, bank slip, and other documents was Gregory Tu's.
Hi, how are you?
Police also consulted a forensic serology investigator about the blood spatters found at the Tu house. He confirmed they were consistent with a high-velocity wound, most likely from a gunshot. Despite all the evidence investigators had collected, their case was still flawed. They needed something solid to prove murder. Without Lisa's body, the only physical evidence they had was blood from the house.
In a divorce settlement.
They had to somehow tie it to the victim.
Kathy, Karen, and Linda, and they all
They had only one chance, and it was a long shot. To prove Lisa Tu had been murdered, Maryland investigators had to link her to the blood in the house. They hoped forensic DNA analysis could do that, but in 1988, it was still in its infancy. In fact, DNA evidence had only been used in a few trials nationally, none of them murder cases. And the Tu case posed a significant challenge. There were no known samples of Lisa Tu's DNA that could be used for comparison. Without them, it would be difficult to connect Lisa with the blood spatter. The DNA lab needed to perform a reverse paternity test, but this time they would have to work backward. They would determine Lisa's DNA from the blood of her son. Because Kai Lau was a genetic combination of both his parents, scientists could, in theory, forensically subtract his father's DNA from his blood. What remained would be Lisa's DNA profile. Blood was drawn from Kai Lau and from his father in Hong Kong for comparison. By process of elimination, the lab confirmed with 98 to 99% accuracy that blood found at the Tu house was Lisa's. With forensic DNA testing, detectives were able to prove homicide. Investigators believe Gregory Tu was moved to murder by jealousy over his wife's affair and the prospect of solving his financial problems with her life insurance. They pieced together a likely scenario for the night of July 14th. There were indications that the couple had argued, perhaps over the affair, perhaps about money. Desperate and enraged, Gregory Tu pulled his gun from the cabinet and shot Lisa. He then disposed of her body. Despite his protestations of innocence, Gregory Tu was convicted of first-degree murder on November 21st, 1989. He is currently serving a life sentence. Lisa Tu's body has never been found. Once, police had no chance of proving murder without a body. But today, they can make a case on forensic science, even when the victim has disappeared without a trace.